Hey guys, Wenzl from Hooch here. I have a special guest tonight. Well, actually, it was in the morning. But anyway, I have a special guest. I have an interview with Steve Kaufman, the author of Unified Reality Theory. It's a great book if any one of you is into quantum mechanics or into understanding the nature of reality. Get his book or check out the interview I'm about to show. It's essentially how consciousness can evolve into existence. So he kind of reverses that whole idea that consciousness arises out of physical matter, but rather consciousness creates physical matter, which is a theory that makes more sense when looking at quantum mechanics. Anyway, join me at this interview. Hope you like it. So the reason I'm really interested in your work is because I'm currently writing a book about an experience I had, and I'm trying to find rational frameworks that I can use to conceptualize what I experienced. And essentially what happened to me is a year ago I went to a meditation retreat, and I meditated for 10 hours a day for 10 days, and I kind of left this realm and had all sorts of experiences in other realities that were equally as real as this one. And yeah, and then I came back and I was like, whoa, I wasn't really religious or anything. And I was like, how is that possible if you believe in a physical universe? So I was wondering if you could give us a rundown of what your theory is in a nutshell.
The theory in a nutshell is that the universe, the reality that we experience, is produced through the relation of consciousness to itself. And so underlying that then is the idea that opposite of what the mainstream theory of reality is, of materialism, that there are these little physical objects that are the most real that then create this thing we call consciousness that then somehow perceives the physical reality, that it is consciousness that is the fundamental reality, or actually what I now refer to as actuality. It's consciousness that is there first, that then through relation to itself, through iterative relation to itself, meaning it forms a relation to itself, and then once it's in that relation it's able to form another relation, on and on and on. It eventually evolves into not what we see as reality, because what we see as reality is something other than consciousness, but it evolves into what underlies reality. It evolves into the forms that are the basis of what we apprehend as reality. So that, again, in essence, though, it's consciousness is first, and consciousness remains first. Consciousness remains the fundamental actuality that underlies what we perceive as reality. And that what we perceive then as reality, the main differentiation is that consciousness is formlessness. Consciousness has no form. Pure being has no form. All that we apprehend as reality, be it emotional, mental, or physical, is a form, is something that basically arises where consciousness forms a relation with itself, and it's just simply a boundary that arises where consciousness becomes defined in relation to itself. And then consciousness apprehends that reality, or apprehends that form as reality, simply because it's arisen within itself. Consciousness and beingness is intrinsically aware of itself as being, and so when in relation to itself a form arises, it also becomes aware of that form, and we call that form reality or experience.
And you call it the will, the force that creates the repetitive self relation, right?
Well, it's changed. When that book was written, the one you read, I assume, was Unified Reality Theory, was written, I finished it 15 years ago, or so, and since then, the same framework exists. I continue from the same framework, although the terminology has changed and become more refined
Yeah.
over time. And so what creates, the thing that underlies, it's beingness. I used to call it existence, now I call it beingness, because now existence to me is more something that arises out of reality, not arises out of reality. Existence is what arises out of beingness. Reality and existence are equivalent. They arise out of beingness. Beingness doesn't arise out of anything. It simply is what it's what is. It's the baseline. And so, why does beingness flow into itself? Why does beingness flow in relation to itself and create reality? I mean, again, these are things that are beyond the ability to conceive, because again, you're talking about beingness at a level before there's even conception. I mean, beingness, whatever motivates it to become reality, is occurring at a level before it becomes even a mental conception. Although we can look back and say, okay, but to me it seems most likely. And again, why do we live? Why do we anything? It's just enjoying itself. It's just the expression of its own enjoyment of being.
Yeah.
It just is, and it's enjoying itself, and outward it goes. Outward and into itself, basically.
Yeah.
And here we are.
And Tom Campbell refers to the motivation of he doesn't call it beingness, he calls it AUM, but he essentially makes the same assumption that there's this primordial consciousness that evolves by forming relations to itself, and that essentially the physical reality as we experience is just a really complex, highly evolved structure of self-relations. And he believes that the goal is to lower entropy.
See, that's more technical than that. For me, the goal is for consciousness to become aware of itself as that. Our essential situation is that as human beings is that we are consciousness, but we think we are forms. We think we are people. We think we are bodies, or our whatever thoughts that make up our ego. But what we are is formless. Our true nature is formlessness. I mean, what is it that right now is hearing the words? What is it that is apprehending the words? I mean, you can't put a finger on it. You can't define that. You can't you can try to conceptualize it, but it can't be. It's just what's there, and without that being there, without that beingness that's there, hearing or seeing or apprehending, there is no reality. Yeah. And so, to me, I don't, lowering entropy, again, he may be correct and from his terminology and from his own framework of how he sees things, but I just use a different framework, I guess.
Right. Now, I think you both use the same framework. It's just, the terminology. I mean, lowering entropy is essentially forming more relationships with the self. And he then also makes the argument that love consciousness is the lowest form of entropy in a consciousness. So,
well, I suppose that would be true. I can see that. I mean, if he says the goal is to lower entropy.
Yeah.
That would be to a return to a state of non-relation then, because the more relations are more entropy, right? I mean, the more consciousness is in relation to itself, the more. I mean, higher entropy is more organization, more greater complex form. So I suppose it's true, yeah. I mean, so ultimately, as for consciousness, in order to animate these, in order for there to be a form for consciousness to even not to animate. I mean, the forms that our bodies are composed of consciousness. The world around you, underneath the veneer.
You're breaking up. Damn it. Well, you're breaking up. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you say that last part again?
Okay, whatever. Again, what Campbell's talking about entropy, I guess it does. I mean, he's just using different terminology, because returning to a lower entropy would be is beingness, forms relations with itself over and over and over again, and as the relations become more, it forms more levels of relation, that would be higher entropy. That would be more complex forms, and as it forms these more complex forms, eventually the point arises where beingness is able to then flow through itself, flow through the forms it has created, and that's what we call life. Beingness flowing through a form of itself, animating that form. And so, what lower entropy would be beingness in form while still flowing through form, realizing its formless or unconditioned or non-form state. which would be, I suppose, lower entropy. But what I was saying when we went out was that, I mean, everything, whatever you see around you, is ultimately composed of consciousness. It's composed of this beingness. It appears as this and that. It appears as form, but underlying the veneer of reality, the reflection, is consciousness being in relation to itself. And so, and at some point, it's consciousness flowing in relation to itself. And which is why, again, at the level of, physical reality, when they dive down as deep as they can get, it turns into wave and particle.
Right.
Because they can't actually, any attempt to define what's actually there will always present you with opposite forms, neither of which can be apprehended simultaneously, because the relation creates the form, but what's actually there is formless consciousness, which is flowing in relation to itself, which has no form. And so that same being, that same formlessness that is there underlying reality, is the same formlessness, the same formless consciousness that apprehends reality. Right. It's the same formless consciousness that's hearing these words now. And so lower, what Campbell refers to as lower entropy would be the return of that consciousness to the state where it simply realizes its non-relational self, that it is in the absence, it still is even in the absence of any relation to itself, in the absence of creating form. Because again, it's the relations of consciousness to itself that create form that it then apprehends as reality. But consciousness, and that's where we're trapped within as humans, we're trapped within this mental state where we're constantly creating forms that we think are ourselves, so we create more forms, and that we've totally lost touch with the idea, or even with the idea, it's not even an idea, but with the reality, the actuality that we are this formlessness.
Right.
And so,
but that is an interesting point, because I don't think that high entropy equals complexity. Because if complexity is organized, then it could also be low entropy. Right? Complexity is only high entropy if it's chaotic, if no structure is present.
See, there we're getting into different terminologies, and again, so from my position, but again, I could be wrong, but to me, high entropy equals high complexity, and things go, an increase in entropy is an increase in complexity.
Oh, okay.
And a decrease in entropy is a decrease in complexity. Okay. So an increase in entropy is an increase in organization. Now, the organization can be chaotic or it can be non-chaotic, but it still is an increase in complexity. But a decrease in entropy.
Yeah, I think he refers to the terms opposite. That he says that, not opposite, but for him the entropy equals chaos. So that could essentially be complex organization that's low entropy. But yeah.
So let's just forget entropy for that.
Okay.
Because, yeah. But what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts and feelings on the nature of things?
My thought, I'm slowly constructing my own worldview, and I'm thinking from a really big picture, and parts of what I'm assuming is only based on my own experience and other people's experience, but it's something I can't prove scientifically. So I think, well, my large view is that we're here on Earth, or experiencing reality, essentially to gather experience. And that this consciousness, this formless consciousness, needs this experience to grow. And after we die, our formless consciousness either goes to a different place, has more experience, comes back as a human, whatever it is. And there is also all these different realities that we can go into without leaving time or space, because time and space are both illusions. And that is called out-of-body experiences or astral projection or whatever. And in these other realms, in these different perspectives, we are much bigger. We are not just one individual. That illusion of the self disappears, and all of a sudden we are in touch with beings that are part of us, that are interested in our earthly experience and that are guides in that sense, but that are also part of the self, of the larger self. So that's essentially what I was experiencing. And, these beings were like telling me that there's this specific thing I need to do. And it was really hard for me to like understand what it is I need to do, because I was not, first of all, mystical, and I was an atheist, and like I was like, I'm going crazy, what is this all about? So the first time I like aborted this, I like kind of fled back into the physical world, and then I spent another year meditating and reading about quantum physics, about mysticism, and I realized that it's highly possible that what I experienced was real, just not yet completely understood by humanity, or at least by the most part. And then a year later, that same thing happened, and essentially then I left my body, my energy body, and I went into this realm in which I had to like accelerate into an infinite 8. And that was like a really complicated mission, and these beings were telling me that it's part of essentially gathering all the experience on Earth and then leave. And so I'm studying right now Robert Monroe and trying to figure out how that all fits in. And I'm also, like, as I'm writing my book, I want to like share my experience and be like, this is what I experienced. And then, I don't really know how to interpret it, because coming back into this realm where time and space is, where I have to use language and logic in the linear sense as we know it, it's really difficult not to create contradictions and unclear explanations. But
As I know, yes,
yeah,
indeed.
so but I think your theory and Tom Campbell's theory of physics like would allow for other realms to exist, essentially, right?
Any reality. I mean, again, reality is only a relation of consciousness to itself. This is simply one particular space-time, is simply one framework of relation within which consciousness is being in relation to itself. I mean, it's a particular framework within which particular forms and so particular realities arise. But, before there was space, there was still beingness, and space is just one, what we call space, the whole universe is just one way that consciousness is flowing in relation to itself, is projecting into itself. I mean, it would be insane, or not, it'd be absurd to think that space was the only reality, and not the only reality, but space was the only projection of consciousness into itself. I mean, it could project itself into itself in any, who knows what ways. I mean, ways we can't conceive, because they're completely different. They would create completely different forms of which then consciousness would be aware. So now you say you were an atheist, but you took all this time meditating. There must have been then some doubt, or you must have had some.
I just discovered that meditation like helps me be happier.
I see. Well, there you go.
And I wasn't really interested in like the mystical aspect of it. But I'm an extreme person, and as soon as I get into something, I get like all the way into it. So I like went to this retreat and did like 10 hours a day for 10 days. And then I was like, holy shit, this whole thing is an illusion, But it wasn't like an intellectual realization. It was more like the deepest part of myself was like, what? I'm trapped in here, This is just an experiential reality that doesn't actually exist. And then, like, I got in touch with like the beings that were like, essentially my like longer, more experienced guides that have like guided me into experiencing this. And in the beginning, it was like sort of like resentment, like that. Why am I put into this, and why am I here? And it was like really an existential, deep, intense breakdown. But then I realized that I'm here to learn, to gather information, gather experience. And yeah, so then I slowly like formed like a worldview that is a mixture of scientific atheism with mysticism, but in a sense it's not really mysticism. I just think it's an extension of of science and intellectual exploration. I think that, mysticism is only mysticism if you look at it from the perspective of rigid materialistic science.
Yes, exactly.
I don't think mysticism actually exists. It's just the attempt to get in touch with the larger reality system, and then being, maybe not. Then realizing that we need to change our fundamental assumption about the physical matter reality in order to comprehend formless existence, or consciousness in itself, and what it can create and what its purpose is in a sense. And now I believe that the purpose of existence is to create love consciousness, to essentially, bring all these unique experiences together in a way that we positively interact with the world. And that in itself is such a long, crazy process. It's like, for me, that's like uniting paradoxes, and at the same time balancing opposites. So it's this human life for me is this complex juggling process in which we need to unite things that apparently seem not to go together. And
all things are united. I mean, all duality arises. There is. Beingness, consciousness is itself non-dual. And when you said, the world around us does exist, the reality does exist. It's just not what's actually there.
Right.
What's actually there is consciousness, and that's the differentiation. That's why people have gotten into, it's so difficult. Say, well, reality is not real. Well, no, reality is real. But what is real? What does it mean for something to be real? And it turns out being real only means something is the product of a relation, a product of a relationship. That's all reality is. It's a form that arises within a formless beingness that itself is beyond reality because it is what's actually there. It's all there actually is that beingness,
right,
that then through relation to itself creates and brings into existence what that same beingness then apprehends as reality. And the reality it brings into being, the reality it apprehends, depends on the relation it's formed. That's why you have emotional reality, which is the first level. The first relations consciousness forms with itself create what we apprehend as the most nebulous of realities, the emotional form, emotional reality. Then next, higher level relations create mental realities, create the forms we apprehend as mental realities. Then still higher order relations create the forms we apprehend as physical reality. And in terms of what you've experienced, in terms of the different, to put what your experiences into some context, your out-of-body experience, experiencing different realities. The different realities you experienced were different than different forms that you apprehended, the different forms of the consciousness that you was able to become involved in relationships outside of this time-space reality and apprehend different forms, is essentially, and as different realities, is no different than our apprehension of the different forms within this one reality as different realities. We have the experience of emotion, we have the experience of mental reality, we have the experience of physical reality. And in terms of how different those realities can be, look at the difference. In fact, it's again serendipitous or synchronicity that we're talking today, because just today I figured out what the difference is between why dreams appear as they do versus being awake. Look at the difference. When we're awake, a dream appears unreal. When we're awake, the reality of the dream is more unreal, and the external reality is more real. But when we're sleeping, when we're actually dreaming while within the dream, that dream reality is reality. That is our reality. And so why is that? What is the difference? Why does at one point in time it appears as unreal or less than real, but at another point in time it appears as the reality? And it's simply a matter of perspective. That when we're awake, the relationships that create physical form are external, and the relation that creates the mental form is internal. And so the external, for whatever reason, I haven't quite sussed that out, always appears more real. But as we go into sleep, and when does dreaming occur? Dreaming occurs as we move into deep sleep, which is when actually the flow of beingness actually moves back into its fundamental nature. And so as it moves back, there's 2 points, but we dream both as we're falling asleep and as we're waking up, and at both points, our perspective changes from where the mental reality is no longer internal. As we flow back, suddenly mental reality becomes external, and physical reality is gone. It's not
Yeah.
even, you don't apprehend it anymore. Poof, and so at that point we move beyond. Form has this perspective. Mental reality is out here. Physical reality is outer. Mental form is inner. But as we move into sleep, mental becomes outer, and
Right.
it becomes then completely. It changes completely in how we perceive it, and suddenly it becomes somewhat tangible, and it becomes more real.
Physical, almost. Yeah. And
Exactly, it does. From within the dream
yeah.
state, it becomes like physical. And so the form, what we apprehend as reality, is we see suddenly the reality of what we touch, the reality, the seeming tangibility, and the reality has more to do with our perspective upon the form we're
Yeah.
perceiving than it does upon the nature of the form itself, which is then puts in your thing. So what you experience as these different realities, you simply had created a relation then to these forms. You would drop beyond whatever, apparently drop beyond this time space reality back to a more fundamental level of beingness, to where you could then apprehend these forms that, from other relations,
Yeah.
other levels of being.
Um, how Tom Campbell approached this specific problem is he says that the whole thing's a data stream. That there is no external reality ever. It's just that we're receiving that data stream that gives us the model of an external reality. And when we're like in a sleep or when we are in an out of body experience, we simply connect to a different data stream. And yeah, and then he talks about virtual realities too, that the whole thing could be considered a simulation. Which is it's it gives me like an eerie feeling to think of the whole thing as a simulation. But in technical terms, I think it's not different than what we're talking about, or what do you think?
Reality, the forms are a simulation. They are different in nature. For me, for me, things are much more simple. There's beingness, beingness, consciousness, awareness, the Tao, Brahman, Buddha, nature, all mean the same. They're all words that point to the same thing.
Yeah.
That fundamental level of being that is, because you can't have nothing. Why is there anything? You can't really why is there anything? Why is there beingness? Why is there this thing that's uncreated? Because you can't have nothing. If you wipe everything out, you totally eliminate everything, so there's absolutely nothing. That absolute nothingness is still what is. That you can't possibly, there can't be absolutely nothing, because the absolute nothingness becomes the isness. And that is the baseline from where that's the isness, the bottom line state, of no, I suppose he would say no entropy, or of just being. And out of that level of beingness, then that beingness begins to flow in relation to itself, and then that actuality begins to moves and just forms a relation with itself, and form comes into existence, not into being, because form. And so there's really there are two things, one of which is the actuality of beingness, the other which is the forms that make up what we perceive as reality. And so that's the framework from within which I work. Is just that simplicity of that. There's the beingness, and there's the form, and that those two things are completely different in nature. The one is what is, and it is not created. It doesn't have to come into being. The other is created. It's temporary. It comes and goes. It's only a boundary that arises where beingness flows in relation to itself. So in that respect, all that we apprehend as reality is a simulation. It's a form that arises within beingness.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't mean it's not real, because that's what reality is. It is a form that arises within beingness. But to me, that the goal, if there's any goal, is to realize that yourself as the beingness and not as the form.
Right.
To completely realize and become fully aware that you are this beingness, know yourself as the actuality and not as the form that the actuality creates.
So it's kind of like we're playing this game of illusion of what forms that are just created by the relationship between beingness to itself, and the goal of the game is to essentially realize that we're playing this game.
To some degree, yeah, and to enjoy ourselves while doing it.
Right.
And once you realize that you are that beingness, the game becomes enjoyable instead of painful and frustrating. Right. Once you know yourself as the beingness instead of just the form, when you know yourself as just the forms are so serious. The forms are all there is. When the only reality is form, when form is all there is, forms are taken way too seriously, and reality becomes too serious.
Forms are the way to think. I like that. Yeah, it's true.
It is, and so everything becomes so serious and so important, and all this. And instead of just but again, like when the perspective is different, we go, oh, that's just there, and no matter what happens in this world of form, beingness, I still am. Then it's not so important anymore.
Yeah.
You can enjoy the stuff more, and life becomes more enjoyable.
Totally.
And which is and the natural state of beingness is a state of enjoyment, a state of satisfaction, a state of completion.
Yeah.
And beingness is not looking to complete itself. Beingness is not becoming all this in order to complete itself. It's already complete. It already is what it is. It's becoming this as simply an extension of the enjoyment of its own beingness and experiencing itself. And I mean, again, these are concepts which, what it's actually, the actual thing is beyond any words, or so far beyond what we could conceive, probably.
Right. And what you said earlier about 3 different levels of reality: emotional, physical, and mental, not in that order, but these 3 categories, how do they separate themselves from each other? Or how are they separated from each other?
Well, they're separated because they represent different levels of form, which are different than levels of relation of being to itself. I mean, the simplest way here we have a rubber band. The first emotion, if the rubber band represents, undifferentiated or, beingness, just no form, formless beingness, then we have nothing here. But then the first relations to itself create the first forms, the boundaries that arise where the rubber band flows in relation to itself. That would be emotional reality. But then as the relations become more and more, another level of form arises, another level of relation arises. And within that level of relation, there is another form that arises, another boundary arises, and that would be mental form. And then as the relations become more and more complex and the forms then bop into each other and create another form where they meet, that's then physical reality. So the different forms apprehended as the different experiences arise as, again, beingness becomes iteratively, progressively in relation to itself. Again, and in my book, if you've read, the very first relations create the structure of space, which is also the structure of mind. Mind and space are not 2 different things. They're simply what appear to be 2 different things viewed from internal and external. There's only the actuality of beingness in relation to itself. Beingness in relation to itself. Same thing, really. It's like a river. A river is still water even when it's forming and swirling in a whirlpool. But so the different experiences, the different levels of not really levels, but the different experiential realities we apprehend within this framework, emotional, mental, and physical, simply arise as the complex or the level of relation increases, creating different forms.
So from that perspective, would there have been a reality that's purely emotional before there's one that's physical?
Yes. Yes, without question. I mean, before, and just as there's purely reality, this is the pure mental reality is there before there's a physical reality. It goes in that order. But again, it's not. But again, what's actually there is not the reality. What's actually there is the beingness in relation to itself. So what you're saying is there. What you're really saying is there a level of beingness flowing in relation to itself that creates only an emotional reality before beingness then flows in relation to itself at a higher level and at a more complicated level and creates a mental reality? And the answer is yes. There has to be. You cannot have the second floor of a building without the first floor being there. The relations of beingness to itself that allow for and create mental form, the forms that we apprehend as mental reality, can only be because there is already the first level of form there that allow for those more complicated relations, those more iterated relations, I should say. And the same then is true of physical reality. It's only once, First, you have the relations of beingness to itself that create the forms that beingness apprehends as emotional reality. Those are the most fundamental forms. Emotional reality is the most fundamental reality, but that reality has as its basis a fundamental level of relation of beingness to itself. That's what's actually there. Always beingness in relation to itself. Not the forms, but beingness. And then beingness, once it's in that level of relation, can then form a more iterated level of relation, which then creates a different form it apprehends as mental reality. So you have the level of beingness in relation to itself creating the emotional, form. Then you have, based on that, beingness forms another level of relation to itself where it creates the mental, what it apprehends as mental reality. And so mental reality lies above, the emotional reality, and then based on that, based not from the mental reality, but from what is perceived as the mental reality, which is really, again, from that level of relation of beingness to itself, beingness then forms another level, a higher order level of relation, which then creates the forms that we apprehend as physical reality. And go ahead.
So without having the mental reality, the physical reality can exist.
That's correct. There has to be the level of relation of beingness to itself to create the mental level, the mental form before it can create. Which is why, again, when we go to sleep, when we pass from being awake, where beingness is flowing through us, projecting itself and experiencing external form as a physical reality, and yet we can still turn within and experience mental reality, but not in the same way we do when we're dreaming. We still turn within. We can see thoughts. But when we're up here, as we fall asleep and the flow drops back down to the more unconditioned level, that suddenly dream reality, then mental reality becomes more real, because we've dropped from one level of being, one level of relation. The body doesn't go away. The body's still there. The forms are still there. But again, the flow of beingness through the form that animates the form simply recedes back into the ocean, and then it's a back and forth, which for some reason I haven't figured out. It is necessary for the form, beingness. It flows in, but it can only sustain the full flow for so long into form, animating the form. Then it has to flow back out. And what we see through the dream state is just simply the passage of the flow of beingness back down beyond the mental realm into the mental realm, where then mental reality becomes the reality, which is what a dream state is. I mean, in dream state, mental reality is the reality. Like, as you said, it's more like physical reality, because again, it's externally perceived then from that perspective.
Oh, right. So in a sense, you could also argue that in a dream space, the mental reality shifts from this physical reality inwardly, and then there creates another physical reality.
No, I wouldn't put it that way, because mental reality then. No, because mental reality is always there. Mental reality is created by a particular set of relations of beingness to itself. Those relations don't change. It's simply our perspective upon those relations. It's our perspective upon the forms created by the relations that changes what it appears as. That again, it's always underlying the reality is always the relation of beingness to itself. That doesn't change, because without that, if that changed, everything would fall apart.
Right.
I mean, so the beingness in relation to itself stays the same, and the relations and so how you perceive the forms created by those relations, though, changes the appearance of the reality. When we're looking at the forms of mental reality from this level, the physical, the physical level, from this level of relation, the only way we can, from where we're all awake, the only way we can apprehend the forms of mental reality are by looking within. And from looking at those forms from within, they appear as they appear to us while awake, as more nebulous, as less real than physical reality, as that's the same form. But then, as you move past, as we fall asleep and move beyond that level of beingness in relation to itself, to where suddenly the physical, where the mental is now seen from external, that same form now becomes the opposite. It becomes more real. It becomes more like physical reality. It's still a mental reality. It's still the same form, but it's simply like wave-particle duality. It's the same exact form seen from opposite perspectives. So one level appearing like a wave, and one level appearing like a particle. For example, a direct analogy would be, from above, from the physical level, or from the high, looking at it from within, mental reality is more like the wave reality. It's nebulous. It's formless. It's kind of spread out. But as we drop below, boom, that same form seen from the the same form which was seen as a wave kind of, then we come below, boom, it becomes more particulate, it becomes more real, more solid. And it's, again, the same form seen from two different perspectives that then appears in, again, in the waking state as still a form. I mean, thought is still a form, but when seen from the opposite side, it becomes more particulate, more solid.
Makes sense. When you were earlier saying the emotional reality, right, the first relationship of the beingness to itself, do you think that beings or conscious awareness migrates from animals to other beings in order to learn to navigate through those particular relationships of beingness to itself? So, for example, an animal or a dog has a purely emotional reality, right? It has not much thought, or has no thought, maybe, who knows. So maybe awareness, being a dog or being a cat or being another animal, that awareness gets structured through essentially the form of the cat or the form of the dog, which is, from a more abstract perspective, constructed out of its drives and emotional needs, right? So beingness gets shaped by these drives and needs of this physical dog in an emotional sense. And after passing through the dog, this awareness has been morphed into by repeatedly experiencing emotional reality. Is that a way too far out idea, or do you think that's
No, not at all. No, but there are aspects of truth there. And the thing is, it's trying to approach any of this stuff. First you have to say, what is an individual? What exactly does it mean for something to be alive? What is there really any, and if you look at it, whether it's an insect, a dog, a cat, a person, what is the difference between an animate form like that and a rock, or somebody when they're alive and dead? The difference is whether or not beingness is flowing through the form. If beingness, all forms are, a rock is still beingness, but beingness is flowing into the form as the form. It's not flowing so much through the form. The evolution of form is such that a level of complexity is reached that beingness is able to form this highest order relation of itself that is actually able to flow through itself as form. And that's what animates the form. So whether it's a dog or cat or person, you have beingness flowing through the form, and as beingness flows through the form, experience is what you said. I mean, yes, it becomes conditioned. It creates the experiential reality is created for beingness as it flows through the form. And what people don't realize is that we all are creating a completely unique experiential reality around us. If you had three people in the room and they were all looking at what they thought was the same vase, you are each apprehending a unique vase,
right?
Because you are each in relation to what is actually there in a different way and creating a different form that you are then apprehending. People think, oh, we're all seeing the same chair, we're all seeing the same thing. No, as beingness flows through form, for every being, it's creating a completely unique reality. And so, and what you said about the dogs and not having as much thought, and cats, I mean, and just experience things from a more emotional level, probably that's the case. And so, but in terms of how that evolves, but it's the same beingness, beingness only. There are individual flows of beingness that create individual realities, but beingness itself is never separable from itself. So it appears that there are separate individuals and different individuals, but there's still really only the one beingness that then flows through these different forms, these different openings, and as it flows through those forms, unique and different realities are created, which then the beingness, as it flows through that form, identifies with those realities, identifies itself with those forms or as those forms. Now, what you're saying, I think, could be that as beingness flows through and becomes conditioned and identifies with forms, that even when the form goes away, it's developed these patterns of flow that are not, they're not necessarily, some of which aren't dependent on the form. He's developed patterns of flow that exist still maybe at the mental level. The physical body fades away, the mental's still there, the level of mental relation. If there are these patterns that persist, and then that flows into a different form. So it could be that is what they talk
Yeah,
about.
I think I've been thinking a lot about these patterns, and there seems to be many different ways of interpreting them. Actually, I need 1 second. It's
Sure,
running
sure.
out of battery.
All right.
Oops. Let me get a charger here. See how it looks like.
You can plug it here.
So, yeah, patterns of existence, right? Patterns of experience. Rupert Sheldrake refers to them as fields, right? Information fields. Carl Jung refers to them as the archetypes. Robert Monroe refers to them as H-bands. And I think all of them are taking a different perspective of the same thing. And Robert Monroe, he pioneered out-of-body experiences. Didn't pioneer them, but he really popularized them in the West by writing detailed books about every journey he went on. And he did that for 30 years, just like leaving his body almost every night and exploring the non-physical reality. And he did a bunch of tests where he would go leave his body, visit a friend, watch what he did, go back to his body, call his friend and confirm that he actually watched him. And he started a lot of his friends and also formed a research institute where he developed soundtracks that help people go into out-of-body experiences. And towards, once he became more familiar with the technique, he was able to leave this realm and go into other realms. And there he saw a perspective where he saw H-bands. Essentially, he calls them human radiation. So the mental energy that we put out creates circles around the planet from some different perspective, not from this physical perspective, but from the non-physical perspective. He could see them. And in each band, they were organized by energy. For example, all fear energy was in one band. And if he went in that, it would be really intense, and he would be overloaded with that energy and all thoughts and emotions that category of energy, those patterns emitted. And then the higher up he got, the more love-based energy there was. And also, in each band there was belief systems where all the dead people, deceased souls, were in their own belief systems. So he says that when you die, your being immediately floats to a belief system that matches with what you have experienced and what you have comprehended. So it's pretty mind-blowing, his books, because it's very scientific, but at the same time what he is experiencing is so far out there. But anyway, and then he writes about meeting, beings that are waiting to become human, that are waiting to enter this cycle. And some of them are dogs. and yeah, he even says that he met a dolphin in the non-physical world. That was I have learned everything I could at the planet, but I still have a body. It's a fish. It's a dolphin. And so he writes about this kind of experience, and it makes you think, like, is that real? Is it not real? But like the research I've done, he's a really well-respected man that has done a significant amount of research in the topic, has led courses where he taught every single person in the course how to do these things, and then they have compared the experiences and found that they were matching. Even done out-of-body experiences together, two people leaving at the same time, meeting up, going back to different rooms, being individually interviewed and reporting the same things. So pretty incredible. And then, Rupert Sheldrake says there's these fields that we all are constantly accessing, and that anything we do, think, or experience becomes morphed into these fields. And yeah, so in a way I think, and Carl Jung's archetypes is the same thing, right? Like that he says there's these specific shapes of patterns of behavior that human beings keep recreating, and that seems to be the value of the human experience, or the value of experiencing time and space. To experience these shapes, and then create more relationships between these shapes of beings, and essentially evolve in that sense. Does that make any sense? What is your take on that?
Well, there's obviously truth there, and the question is, how deep does, the archetypes are the thing I can relate to most, but again, when you talk about forms, again, all experience, all experience is beingness apprehending a form. And so, for you to have any thought or experience any reality requires the involvement of your beingness in some relation. So for beingness to apprehend, so if beingness is a belief structure a belief structure requires a consistent pattern of flow of beingness to create the forms that it then apprehends as that consistent belief structure. So if beingness has a belief structure that somehow at a fundamental level is able to persist, beyond the physical form. If one dies and yet there's still, in some very fundamental way, there's the same belief structures being held to, which that can only be because beingness is still flowing in the pattern necessary, that is flowing in the relation to itself necessary to create the form it then apprehends as the belief system, as the belief structure. And so that would be one way, yes, that beyond life, again, beingness would continue to flow in a pattern, but again, it's a self-sustaining pattern, because as long as it continues to believe that the forms are real, as long as it continues to believe in those forms, it continues to flow in the pattern that creates the form. And as long as it's flowing in that pattern, it still is beingness. It's still unconditioned beingness, but it's beingness caught in a pattern of flow.
Yeah.
That then, and the only way it can break out of that flow is by at some point in time getting to the point where it realizes I am not the form. I am the formlessness that's flowing. And then at which point all the form. Again, it doesn't mean you're going to stop experiencing reality and stop necessarily enjoying reality. It simply means reality then becomes more enjoyable. You see it from a different perspective. It takes on the seriousness, because you realize that there's, no matter what, life and beyond life and death, there's just beingness.
Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. What you just said, really nicely demonstrates explains something I've been thinking about, which is exactly that. Yeah, how belief structures could, affect beingness beyond the physical existence. Or a physical experience. Hey Steve, the other band members want to leave. We have to go into. But hey, it was really cool talking to you. Thanks for taking the time. And would you mind if I share this video, edit it a little bit, and
you do what you want.
Sweet, awesome.
I will leave you with this: the main thing to distinguish within yourself is what about yourself is form, and what about yourself is formlessness. And because it's within the formlessness that you will find what you really are. that is the thing of all things. I mean, the thing that in what most the human condition is that we are formlessness that has misidentified itself with form and thinks of itself as form, and so as obscurity, even though it's always right there in front of us. It's our awareness is always there, our consciousness is always there, but we think of it as unimportant because we think we're a form.
Yeah.
All right, Chief.
Beautiful. Hey, thanks so much.
All right, you too. Thanks.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
day.
You
Bye.
too. Bye-bye.